doors closed with a sound like thunder. Behind them, the echo of celebration continued, goblets clinking, drunken cheers, men laughing with mouths full of meat. But here, in the high stone chamber lined with heavy tapestries and watching eyes embroidered in silk, the air was different. It was still. It was sharp. It smelled of wax, sweat, and something else. Fear. She stood frozen, back to the wall, corset too tight, ribs aching. Her hands trembled, and though the fire crackled in the hearth, she couldn't feel her fingers. 15 years old. Married hours ago to a man she'd spoken to twice. A king, they called him, a savior of the realm. But, in the quiet of the bedchamber, titles meant nothing. Only power mattered now. Not hers. The sheets had already been turned down. A white cloth laid carefully in the center, not for comfort, but for proof. Blood must be shown. Witnesses waited in the hall. The chamberlain would collect the linen at dawn. If it was clean, the whispers would begin about her body, her honor, her usefulness, her failure. This was not a wedding night. This was an inspection, a performance, a ritual she could not escape. She'd heard the stories. All queens had. Some fainted before their husbands arrived. Some were drugged to stop them from screaming. Some, it was said, were not alone with their kings at all, forced instead to submit in the presence of noblemen or priests so no one could question the union. And if the bride resisted, that word didn't exist in their vocabulary. Resistance was betrayal. Pain was expected. Silence was demanded. Survival was optional. The dress she wore weighed more than she did. Gold embroidery, pearl beading, a veil that still smelled like frankincense. She hadn't eaten since sunrise. They said hunger made a girl easier to shape. More grateful, more obedient. Her ladies-in-waiting had kissed her forehead and wept behind fans, but no one stopped it. This was how it had always been. This was tradition. Then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. A hand on the iron latch. The door opened. He entered. The music downstairs got louder for a moment, as if mocking the silence above. She did not speak. She did not run. She did what she had been taught, closed her eyes, lowered her chin, and waited to disappear. Because tonight she would not be seen as a queen. She would be measured as a body, a vessel, a battlefield dressed in lace. And centuries later, poets would write of royal weddings with words like beauty, grace, and destiny. But they would not tell you what really happened on a medieval queen's wedding night. The queen was not born, she was made, in corridors lined with steel-eyed tutors and prayer rooms that smelled of cold stone. From the age of 5, she was taught to curtsy with her eyes downcast. At 7, she learned to ride, to speak her husband's future tongue, and to bow more deeply to men with titles than to the ache in her back. By 9, she understood how to read a treaty, but not a bedtime story. And by 13, her breasts were watched more closely than her books. Every growth in her body marked a countdown, a clock she could not slow, a vessel nearing its destined use. In quiet hours, when no one was watching, she would press her hand to her chest and wonder if the thudding beneath her ribs was fear or fury. But it made no difference. There was no room for either in her future. She belonged to the kingdom. Even her prayers were rehearsed. Let me be pure. Let me be pleased. Let him not be cruel tonight. But cruelty didn't always wear a sword. Sometimes it came dressed in silk. Sometimes it smiled and kissed your fingers and called you a dove, even as it closed the door behind you and demanded you undress. This was the horror no history book told, that the queen, crowned before the altar and adored by the masses, was less free than the peasant girl who lit her candles. Because the queen could not leave. She could not refuse. She could not run. Royalty was a golden cage, and the wedding night was its iron hinge. Once crossed, the world closed behind her. There was no undoing it, no second chance. She was not merely a wife, she was now the spine of the next dynasty. Her womb was a national asset. Her silence, a requirement. Her suffering, irrelevant. It was this silence, cold, ceremonial, sanctified, that would swallow her whole. The king, if he was kind, might be gentle, but gentleness was not expected of kings. Most arrived drunk and impatient. Some sought violence because they believed it necessary to break a woman into her role. Others didn't bother to look at her at all. They came for the act, for the proof, for the blood. and they left just as quickly. But the queen stayed, staring at the bed curtains that still moved from where she had flinched. Alone, no one would ask how she felt. They would ask only one thing: did she bleed? If yes, she was a success. If not, she was a scandal, an enemy, a burden. In some courts, the solution was brutal. Substitute another woman to produce the evidence. Bribe the midwife. Blame the bedsheets. Lie. Always lie. But if none of that worked, if the whisper of failure reached the king's advisors, then the queen's fate grew thin and sharp. A divorce. A banishment. Or worse, an annulment based on non-consummation, which rendered her not only discarded, but legally worthless. No heirs, no power, no voice. There are letters from royal physicians in which the queen's body is discussed in cold metrics: cervix, womb, hips. She is not named, she is not heard, she is simply a chart to be examined and passed along. And yet these same queens sat beside kings at coronations. Their faces are carved in marble. Their names are sung in hymns. Their portraits are painted with soft eyes and serene smiles. But behind that stillness was another truth. Some of them bled, some of them didn't, some of them screamed, and all of them were watched. Because in the medieval world, the queen's wedding night was the kingdom's business. Her body, a contract. Her pain, a paragraph. Her life, a pawn. And the silence she was taught to keep, that was the final betrayal. She could hear the drums beneath the floorboards, each thump like a second heartbeat she couldn't escape. They called it music, a celebration in the great hall below. But to her, it was a countdown, a death march in disguise. The walls were thick, but not thick enough to silence the sound of men laughing over wine, already telling stories of what was to come. How long would it take? Would she scream? Would she cry? They laughed like it was a game, and for them, it was. Her steps were slow, measured, taut, each movement choreographed by the women who raised her, not to be loved, but to be endured. Grace and silence, they had told her. Soft eyes, quiet mouth. A queen doesn't flinch, but her knees ached, her throat burned, and her stomach twisted with the kind of sickness that could not be named in courtly language. The corridor was lit with candelabras, flames flickering in gold, but everything felt cold. A corridor lined with portraits of long dead brides. Some had died in childbirth. Some had disappeared. Some had gone mad. They all stared down at her now. Not with comfort, but with warning. She had not seen the king since the vows. He had kissed her once, not on the mouth, but on the forehead, like a priest might bless a tomb. His lips were dry, his hands gloved. She was 15, he was nearly 40. She had not been allowed to speak to him before the wedding, only to kneel when he approached. And now she was to lie beneath him. The doors loomed ahead, carved oak, taller than her father's throne, etched with vines and angels and swords. 2 guards stood on either side, blank-faced, as if tonight meant nothing. But one of them avoided her eyes. The lady-in-waiting behind her whispered, "He'll be gentle if you're still," as if it was her movement that might provoke cruelty. As if stillness could erase the violence of being made into property. She nodded. She said nothing. Words would betray her. Tears would displease them. The chamberlain bowed and opened the door. The room swallowed her. Inside, the bed was already turned down. White linens, red petals, a folded nightgown she had never worn. A goblet of wine on the table, untouched. The fire had been lit, but its warmth didn't reach her. Everything was prepared. Everything except her. And yet she stepped forward. She had been taught to walk like this, as if the eyes of the kingdom were always upon her, because they were. This room had watchers, even in its stillness, invisible judges. The midwife who would come in the morning to inspect the cloth, the nobleman who would ask for confirmation, the advisors who would study the king's mood and decide whether the queen had done her duty. Her womb was now their business. Her pain, their expectations. She was not alone, not really even as she stood there, cold, silent, staring at the bed that would define her legacy. She could feel the weight of the walls pressing in. They had seen it before. The shiver, the hesitation, the moment a girl realizes she will not be asked. Only taken. She did not undress. She waited, because to remove her gown would be to participate. And queens do not participate. They endure. She sat at the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. her dress bunched around her like a trap. The roses scattered on the floor had already begun to wilt. She thought about her mother, a queen too once. She had told her nothing before this night, only kissed her on the cheek and said, "Close your eyes. Be still." The latch clicked. He was coming. The door opened behind her, slow and deliberate. She didn't turn. She couldn't. She could smell him first. Wine, leather, smoke. The footsteps that followed were not hurried, not hesitant, just sure. The footsteps of a man who had never been denied anything. She didn't move. The silence between them was thick, choking. When his hands finally touched her back, searching for the clasps of her gown, she felt her soul shrink into the smallest corner of her body, a desperate, quiet retreat, not to escape, but to survive. Because the chamber was not private. It was a stage, and every movement tonight, every breath, every bruise, every drop of blood would be recorded in whispers, in ledgers, in the fate of nations. This was not her night. It was theirs. The cloth was more important than the girl. Before the sun rose, it would be inspected, quietly, discreetly, sometimes by candlelight in a chamber down the hall. It was always white, always folded by a servant trained not to speak. If stained, it was placed in a silver bowl, sometimes paraded before the court like a flag of triumph. If clean, it was burned, silently, with shame thick in the air like incense. Didn't say the words aloud, but everyone knew what they meant. Did she bleed? Because that blood, that small, brutal stain, meant everything. It was proof of virginity, proof of conquest, proof that the king had claimed what was his. It was a royal seal stronger than ink or signature. Without it, treaties could be questioned, lineages could be doubted, the queen herself could be discarded. It didn't matter that bleeding on the wedding night wasn't guaranteed, that some women did not bleed, and some bled far too much. The science didn't matter, the body didn't matter. Only the story did, and the story demanded blood. It was power, distilled into a single mark on a piece of cloth, and that mark could save her life or cost her everything. In many courts, midwives or noblewomen were sent into the chamber the next morning to confirm the consummation. They did not speak to the bride. They did not ask how she felt. They examined the bed like a battlefield. Sheets were lifted, fingers ran along linen, eyes narrowed in judgment. Sometimes a maid would be sent in hours earlier to ensure the king had not left too soon, to make sure that he had, in fact, done what was required of him. If he hadn't, it was the queen who bore the burden. Whispers spread fast. The castle walls were not thick enough to contain doubt, and once doubt was seated about her virginity, her purity, her fitness, it grew like rot. Servants began to stare longer. Ladies in waiting whispered behind doors. Noblemen wrote letters home saying she looked pale, thin, not right. A queen could fall in a single morning if the cloth remained white. So some bled on purpose. Servants were instructed to prick the bride's finger with a needle, to smuggle in blood from elsewhere, to fake the sign that the court demanded. It was dangerous. If discovered, the consequences were devastating. But sometimes it was safer than telling the truth. Because what if she had bled, but not enough? What if she hadn't bled at all? What if the king had failed but blamed her? Men were never questioned. If the marriage had not been consummated, it was the queen's fault. If the king could not perform, she must have resisted. If he left her untouched, she must have been unappealing. There was no logic to it, only a relentless, burning demand for proof. A queen was not expected to enjoy the act. She was expected to endure it, and bleed even if her body screamed in silence, even if her eyes stayed open through the night, waiting for it to be over. Even if, afterward, she curled into herself and wept without sound. The cloth would speak louder than she ever could. And if it bore no stain, she knew what would come next. An annulment, a declaration of impurity, a quiet exile, replaced by another bride more suitable, or worse, a death whispered into law as treason, not for what she did, but for what she failed to prove. This is what the blood meant. It was not pain, it was not biology, it was power, evidence, currency. It was the moment the crown was nailed to her body, and the price of wearing it was silence. He didn't knock. Kings don't knock. He entered like he owned the air. The light. Hershey didn't turn to look at him. She already knew what she would see. The heavy robes half undone, the glint of belt buckles, the wine on his breath. His fingers would be thick from rings and meat. His mouth would slack from drink. His eyes, if they met hers at all, would not search for consent, only obedience. He said nothing, just stood there, watching her sit at the edge of the bed like a soldier awaiting execution. When he moved, it was with entitlement, not lust, not kindness. His hands went to the ties at his waist, then to the clasps of her gown. He didn't ask. He didn't pause. The dress was expensive, embroidered with the hours of women she'd never meet, but he tore at it like rapping on a gift he'd already grown bored of. She flinched once, a breath, sharp and small, and instantly regretted it. Weakness was not allowed, resistance even less so. She bit her lip until it bled, because queens were not supposed to cry, were supposed to endure. This was the moment her tutors had prepared her for, with prayers and perfume and lies. This was the price of alliance, of peace, of the crown they pinned to her head like a shackle. This was her purpose. And still, nothing had prepared her for the sound her heart made when he touched her, the silent scream, the way her soul clawed at the inside of her skin, begging to leave. But there was no escape. His weight was crushing, his breath uneven. He was done before the tears in her throat had even found their way out. And when it was over, he stood, wiped his hands on the sheet like she was something spilled, and left without a word. The door shut behind him. A gust of air rushed in, as if even the chamber exhaled in relief. She lay still, the white cloth beneath her stained, not with blood, but with silence. What he took from her that night was not just a body. It was history. He took the girl she had been, the quiet dignity she'd tried to keep, the secret trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, he would be different. He took all of it. And what he left was a body watched by ghosts, a name bound to legacy, and a future chained to heirs she hadn't yet conceived. This wasn't an act of love. It wasn't even lust. It was conquest. He was king. And kings they took land, they took lives. They took girls and turned them into wives and told them it was holy. And the worst part? Everyone clapped. The next morning they would celebrate. The midwife would nod. The cloth would be displayed or destroyed depending on what it showed. The nobles would toast to a successful union. And she, the queen, would rise, paint her face, and walk among them like nothing had happened. She would smile because she was trained to. She would bless them because she was expected to. She will bleed again maybe tomorrow, maybe next month, until she delivered a child that belonged not to her, but to the realm. No one would ask what he took, because to them he had only done what was his right. But she would never forget the sound of the latch, the feel of her ribs beneath his weight, or the hollowness that followed. The crown stayed on her head. But her name, herself, had vanished into the dark. Not every queen closed her eyes. Not every girl lay still and silent while the doors locked behind her. Some screamed, some fought, some broke the rules carved in stone and paid the price in blood, in shame, in legend. History does not often speak of them because resistance is inconvenient. It ruins the fairy tale. But they existed. Girls who refused to be taken quietly. Their names were buried beneath the weight of dynasties, their stories reduced to rumors, footnotes, scandal. But their defiance still echoes, if you listen closely enough to the places where power once whispered. There was the young noblewoman whose screams could be heard 3 halls away. They said her chambermaid fainted at the sound. She was dragged from the bed by her hair and locked in a tower for madness. The king married her younger sister instead. The treaty stood. The silence resumed. And yet, for one night, the lie cracked. There was the foreign bride who, on her wedding night, ran barefoot through the corridors, blood trailing behind her. The guards caught her before she reached the stables. She was returned, bruised and weeping, but she had tried. God, she had tried. No bards wrote of her bravery, only of her fragility. Then there was Margaret of Valois, though called her promiscuous, dangerous, rebellious. But behind those words was the truth. Margaret refused to be broken. On her wedding night, forced to marry Henry of Navarre for political alliance, she was locked in her room and guarded by men. Her own brother threatened her life. Her mother, the infamous Catherine de' Medici, orchestrated the whole affair. And yet Margaret wrote letters, hid messages in her bodice, defied their plans. She survived more than just the wedding bed. She survived the massacre that followed. She survived betrayal, poison, exile. And she told her story. In her own words, that alone was revolution. There were others, whispers, warnings, a queen who never bore children and never let the king touch her again. She paid with her title, a bride who poisoned her husband before he could lay a hand on her. They burned her as a traitor, a girl of 14 who gritted her teeth and bit the king when he leaned too close. They called it hysteria. She called it mercy. These were not fairy tales. They were not triumphs, not in the way history likes to record. They were sparks, brief and brilliant. In the endless dark, because resistance did not lead to freedom, it led to punishment. But it was still resistance. Still a fist clenched behind a veil. Still a choice, however small, to say no. I am not just a vessel. I am not just your proof. And even in the face of silence, some queens left scars. Not on their bodies. On the walls of the palace. On the pages they were never meant to write. On the servants who saw them flinch and never forgot. History would wash their stories with the same old ink. She was difficult. She was barren. She was mad. But under the layers of dust, the truth remains. Some queens refused to die quietly on their wedding night. They screamed, they ran, lied, they endured, and in doing so, they left behind a blueprint, not for victory, but for survival. For every queen who bled alone, there was one who whispered to a maid, one who burned the stained cloth, one who hid her bruises with powder but kept her head held high. And that mattered, because the world wanted them to vanish to be quiet, to become obedient, invisible wombs wrapped in silk, but some didn't vanish. Some broke, and in their breaking they showed that the chamber wasn't sacred. It was a prison. And sometimes prisoners find the cracks in the wall, every one of them painted with soft eyes and polished skin, hands folded gently on their laps, lips parted just enough to suggest grace, never defiant. The artist captured what the court wanted remembered: beauty, elegance, submission. Not the screams, not the shaking, not the blood. The oil dried smooth, the lies dried clean. But if you look closely, really look, some of those painted eyes are empty. Or worse, pleading. As if the queen inside the frame is trying to tell you something. Not with her mouth, she was never allowed that, but with the dead stillness of her stare. They erased her voice, but the silence she left behind is deafening, because she never got to tell the truth. Not to her ladies-in-waiting, not to her daughters, not to the pages of any book. She carried it instead in her spine, in the tightness of her shoulders, in the way she flinched every time the door clicked shut behind her. The memory of that night, of his breath, the weight, the cloth, stayed lodged in her bone, and like a splinter it festered. She bore children, smiled at feasts, kissed the hands of priests and traitors. She did what queens were meant to do, but the girl she had been never left that chamber. She was buried there, beneath the bed, beneath the linens, beneath the applause. And centuries later, no one remembered her name. Only the name of the son she delivered, the crown she upheld. The treaty she secured with her body, no one asked what it cost her. No one cared. Because queens do not exist for themselves. They exist to hold the kingdom together while their insides break. The silence became tradition, passed from queen to queen like an heirloom. Unspoken warnings tucked into glances, into the stiffness of posture, the twitch of a jaw when marriage was mentioned. They all knew, they all remembered. But none were allowed to say it aloud. Because to speak it, to name the violence, would shatter the myth, and myths kept thrones stable. So they painted smiles, bore sons, and they bled alone behind doors no one dared to open. Some tried to write, secret diaries, hidden pages sewn into dresses, coded letters sent to mothers, sisters, nuns. But most of those were burned, lost, or intercepted, and twisted into threats, because the queen's pain was not just invisible, it was inconvenient. And inconvenient women don't survive history. They become footnotes, rumors, curses. She was cold, they say, difficult, withdrawn. The king sought warmth elsewhere, as was his right. She was replaced, forgotten. Her body buried in a cathedral, her face carved into stone, her story erased before the dust settled. And yet, something lingers, something deeper than documentation, a presence, a pulse, because pain like that, pain endured for a kingdom, pain swallowed in silence leaves an echo. It haunts tapestries. It clings to staircases. It waits in the shadows of bridal chambers, where new queens now stand, smiling for crowds and bleeding in private. You can still feel it in the air, the heaviness, the hush, the way the room knows something the history books do not, because the truth never died. It was just locked away, buried beneath the weight of ceremony and crown. It waited in the dark, not for revenge, but for remembrance. For someone to say, "We see you," for someone to write, "This happened," for someone to finally whisper, "She was more than a vessel. She was a girl. She was afraid." And no one came for her. The myths painted her in gold, but she was flesh. She shook. She bled. She broke. And still she rose, dressed herself in silence and did what they required. But her soul, it never stopped screaming. It screamed across generations. It screamed into the bones of palaces and the dreams of daughters. And now, finally, we must answer, not with pity, not with poetry, but with truth. That the queen's wedding night was never a fairy tale. It was a crucible, a theft, a silence too loud to ignore, and in naming it we do not tarnish history. We cleanse it. We give her back what they took. Her voice, her story, her name, it begins with a dress, always. Silk, pearl, lace, a masterpiece woven not for the woman who wears it, but for those who will see her in it. The dress is a performance. It whispers of of obedience, of a girl prepared to disappear, and underneath it, always, there is a body, trembling, terrified, trained since infancy to stay still while being sacrificed. Because that's what the wedding night was, a quiet sacrifice in a velvet chamber. They called it holy. They called it necessary. They called it tradition. But none of those words comforted her, didn't stop her from biting her tongue to keep from crying out. They didn't soften the sound of the door clicking shut behind her. They didn't take away the smell of wine on his breath, or the feeling of his hands unbuttoning her dress like he was unwrapping a thing, not a person. And they didn't help her the next morning, when the midwife came in to lift the sheet like a scroll, looking for proof that her pain had meant something. What is the name for a silence that echoes for centuries? It's not just history, it's haunting, because these queens, these girls dressed in crowns too heavy for their necks, they didn't vanish. They were erased, scrubbed from memory, smoothed out by paintings, muted in ceremony. Their agony became ritual. Their resistance became madness. Their obedience became legend. And the truth, it got buried in the bedsheets. But it's still there, in every chamber where a girl was told her body was a gift to a man she didn't choose, in every diary that was burned, in every rumor whispered behind lace fans. She didn't bleed. He didn't finish. The queen has failed. We like to tell ourselves that power protects. The queens with their jewels and palaces were lucky, but the truth is they were among the loneliest women in the world, because they had no exit. A maid could run, a servant could flee. But a queen? She had to stay, and smile, and open her legs for diplomacy. Some gave birth to nations, others died before their second moon. All of them were weighed, measured by how much they gave, and how little they asked in return. We do not talk about this, because it disrupts the fantasy. It ruins the romantic idea of royal love. It forces us to confront what was done, not in dungeons, but in sanctified rooms lined with gold. It reminds us that power does not always protect. Sometimes it is imprisoned, and the cost is always paid in silence. It taught her how to walk, how to bow, how to smile without teeth, but they never taught her how to scream, because screaming would shatter everything. The treaties. She felt the lineages, the illusion that this was sacred, and so she didn't scream. She swallowed it, and it lived inside her, a scream that never died. A scream that echoed into the cradle of her first child, a scream that trembled in her hands when she signed decrees on behalf of the very king who took her like a thing to be conquered. She was called consort, she was called mother, she was called blessed, but she was never called survivor. Yet that's what she was, not because she lived, but because she carried it. and still rose, still walked into court the next day with her hair done and her spine straight, still raised her chin when the ambassadors bowed, still bled in silence, still endured. And that is what they'll never understand, the men who wrote her name into history as a footnote, that survival is not weakness, that submission is not consent, that silence, when demanded, is violence, and that the queens they tried to turn into symbols were women first, girls really human, and we owe them more than stories. We owe them truth. Because when we erase what really happened, we allow it to happen again, in different rooms, in different dresses, under different names. When we soften the past, we harden the present. So let us not soften this. Let us say it plainly, the medieval queen's wedding night was a ritual of violence dressed as love. It was silence mistaken for honor. It was history written in blood. And it was women, girls, who bore it with grace so devastating. We mistook it for peace, but it was never peace. It was survival. We look at their portraits and wonder why they seem so still. Now we know, stillness was the only armor they had left. Their stories weren't forgotten, were hidden, were edited out by kings and scribes and artists who only wanted to show the crown, not the bruise beneath it. But we are here now. We are listening. We are looking. We are saying what they could not. That the queen who sat still on her wedding night, waiting to be claimed like a piece of land, she mattered. The one who cried when the door closed, the one who didn't bleed, the one who ran barefoot down the corridor, the one who bit him back, the one who never spoke of it again, they all mattered. All carried a silence heavier than any crown. And now, finally, we will carry it with them. Not as shameful, but it's true. And truth, real, unvarnished truth, is the only thing powerful enough to undo the myth. So, this is for them. The queens who never got to speak, who were told their pain was tradition, who were told their wedding night was beautiful when it was anything but. This is their story, and it is no longer silent. So where does it go, all that pain? The chamber is quiet now. The sheets are gone. The bed is dressed for another season. The walls have been scrubbed and repainted and rebuilt. The portraits still hang in long corridors where tourists whisper and children fidget. The crown is displayed in glass, polished and untouchable. The tour guide says nothing about the blood. And yet, if you pause, really pause, in the bridal chambers of old castles, you can feel it. Something lingers, not a ghost, something heavier, quieter memory. The kind that doesn't live in books, but in walls, in breath, in stillness. She was there, behind the curtain. She walked that hall barefoot once, wrapped in silence, her heart beat louder than the bells ringing in the square. She smiled at the maids and hid the tremble in her fingers. She wore perfume to disguise her fear. She whispered prayers no one heard. And she never said what happened, because queens weren't allowed to have stories, only roles, only obligations, only silence. And for too long, we let the silence win. We told the tale from the king's point of view, how he secured the alliance, won the dowry, sired the heir. We wrote down what he said, what he conquered, what he took, but we never asked what she gave. We never asked what it cost her. And maybe she didn't die that night. Maybe she lived to rule. Maybe she bore 5 sons and hosted banquets and rode beside her husband through cities that bowed before her. Maybe she smiled in every painting, but a part of her never left that room. A part of her curled inward, closed its eyes, and stayed behind. And that's what this story was always about. Not just history, not just ritual, but erasure. Because what really happened on a medieval queen's wedding night wasn't one thing. It wasn't just violence or silence or blood. It was all of it, stitched together and hidden beneath lace and legend. And while we looked at the crown, we forgot to look at the girl. We forgot to ask how she felt when the doors closed, what her breath sounded like in the dark, what it meant to be told with every gesture that her body was not her own, that her pain was not important, that her voice was not welcome here. We talk about kings as if they were gods, but we forget that every king's reign began with a queen's sacrifice. We say royalty and we think of feasts, jewels, triumph. We should think of the girl who was told at 15, "Tonight you become history," not because of what she said or chose or dreamed, but because of what was done to her. We should think of the weight of a velvet dress soaked in fear, the cold air between her skin and his hand, The morning after, when the linen was folded like a decree and the queen was expected to smile, proof or no proof, blood or no blood, as if nothing had happened. We should remember her not for how quietly she suffered, but for the fact that she survived it at all, that she got up, that she dressed again, that she raised children, or bore none, or buried them, or was buried first, that she lived as long as they let her, and longer still in silence, because silence too is a kind of afterlife, but it is not the one she deserved. She deserved to be remembered in her fullness, not as a bride, not as a symbol, but as a woman, with fear, with hope, with a story no one wanted to hear, until now. So, when we walk through castles and admire the tapestries, when we speak of queens and crowns, when we teach history to daughters and sons, let us not forget what was not written. Let us not bow only to the myth. Let us look behind the curtain, behind the veil, behind the title, and see her, truly see her. The girl beneath the gold, the body beneath the lace, the voice behind the silence. Because she was there, and she mattered. You have ever been told to stay quiet. If you have ever been made small, if you have ever given more than they thanked you for, you carry a part of her. You are not alone, and neither was she. Her story is yours now. Hold it with care. Speak it with reverence. And never let them bury her again. If you love this and would also love to see more, comment what you think, like, subscribe. See you next time.